Coronavirus has forced Australians into lockdown, but what about those who can't self-isolate? Over 1,400 asylum seekers are currently being held in crowded detention centres and are at particular risk of infection. Medical experts and human rights organisations have called on the federal government to release those in detention into community accommodation to avoid a mass outbreak of COVID-19. Today I'm speaking with Katie Robertson, who's the Assistant Director at Melbourne University Law School's Centre for Statelessness. A lot of Australians may not be aware of the current situation that's being faced by asylum seekers and refugees with regards to the coronavirus.
There's two key issues, I think, in Australia at the moment in relation to how COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting on refugees and people seeking asylum. Firstly, in relation to the hundreds of thousands of refugees and asylum seekers that are living in the Australian community, many of them are living on very precarious visa arrangements, temporary visa arrangements, which mean, in effect, that they are unable to access Medicare or any sort of financial social security, so Centrelink. The second group that I would say are more at risk of contraction at the moment are people that are in immigration detention centres in Australia. There's currently almost 1,500 people, based on the most recent available government statistics, of people that are in closed immigration detention facilities. And there's been a number of peak medical organisations over the past month to 6 weeks that have actually been calling very strongly on the Australian government to release those people from immigration detention, again because of the health risk these people face. The conditions inside immigration detention centres have been likened to that of a cruise ship, and it's been labelled a potential outbreak hotspot.
And what actions are the government taking to address these concerns?
Unfortunately, none at this stage. So in relation to the first cohort that I mentioned, a lot of peak bodies, particularly the Refugee Council of Australia, have been calling on the Australian government to extend the stimulus package, which they can easily do, to include refugees and people seeking asylum. Secondly, in relation to people in immigration detention, it's interesting that the Australian government's own Department of Health coronavirus alert identifies immigration detention centres as one of the main areas of risk for corona outbreak. Yet the Australian government doesn't seem to be taking its own advice in relation to its own health warning, let alone the warnings of peak medical organisations in Australia. They haven't said much, which is often the way with the Department of Home Affairs and the Minister for Immigration in relation to disclosing information about conditions inside detention centres. But we know from detention centre people in detention centres themselves, there's been reports of lack of hand sanitizer, soap, a number of reports of people having to share very confined spaces, both in immigration detention centres and places of detention that include hotel facilities, including one in Melbourne, in Preston. And also we know that it's not a hypothetical risk. In Brisbane recently, and a guard actually tested positive for COVID-19. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Court proceedings have been issued in the High Court this week on this issue, arguing that the Australian government owes people in immigration detention a legal duty of care to ensure that they have access to adequate healthcare, but also are kept in a safe environment. And it'll be really interesting to see how the government responds to that. It's quite possible, and I would argue likely, based on my experience litigating against the Commonwealth on these exact issues, that in response the Commonwealth will actually make a number of changes to avoid having to proceed with the court hearings or risk a finding against them.
And finally, do you have any messages for people who may be listening who might want to do more? Is there anything that they can do to get involved?
I think the main thing people could really do at the moment is show their support by supporting organisations that are at the coalface at the moment. Organisations like the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre that are really stretched already as it is to support a number of people living in the Australian community that have, as I mentioned, no income source whatsoever. They're people that are not allowed to work and they have no welfare. So supporting and donating to organisations like that, I think, is really important. I'd also consider donating to legal organisations like the Human Rights Law Centre that issued the court proceedings in Australia this week that rely on donations and public support. And thirdly, just think about this issue, talk to your friends about it, talk to people that you know who may not have thought about this issue before. There are people in immigration detention in Melbourne right now that day in, day out, many of them have been in detention for more than 7 years. Just spare a thought for that, and keep that conversation happening with your friends and family.
Katie Robertson, thanks very much for your time.